The world of used old-ish cameras is kind of a weird one. On one hand, you got the people who don't know what they're sitting on, and they're selling great cameras for a very cheap price. And on the other hand, you have all the boomers who are posting their old Canon 400Ds that are almost 20 years old for $400 because that's what they paid for them back in the day. But sometimes you find someone who sells something for the right price. And in this case, I found this. A Canon 10D for the price of $10. And that's a pretty good price if you ask me. So today we're going to take a look at this camera and what it has to offer, and if it has any significance in the year of 2024. This camera is actually 21 years old now. Came out in 2003 and it replaced the Canon D60. This camera has an EF lens mount and an APS-C sensor, which is kind of a weird combo, and it came out before the EFS lenses, so it will not accept EFS lenses. It has an ISO range of 100 to 3200, which is kind of the standard for these old DSLRs. It has a maximum 1/4000th of a second shutter. It can shoot 3 frames per second and can hold a buffer of 9 frames. The resolution of this camera is not very impressive. It has a 6.3 megapixel sensor, so this is not something that you want to shoot large prints with. But we're going to come back to the resolution later on in the video, because it's not all bad. In this video we're going to go through the physical side of the camera first. What I like about it and what I don't like about it when it comes to holding and using this camera. Then we're going to look at the image quality stuff, and at the end we're going to go through some pictures and take a look at what this camera can actually do. Bear in mind that I am not a professional photographer, I'm just a hobbyist who tends to like using old cameras, and I haven't been photographing much in the last years. Now my interest is more in trying out old stuff and reviewing it, and yeah, telling you about it so you can make a better informed decision if you want to buy these kinds of cameras or not. First thing you're going to notice with this camera is that it's large and heavy. I have big hands and I feel that this camera is big. Someone with really small fingers will probably struggle a bit with this when it comes to reaching all the knobs and buttons. I, on the other hand, I don't have a problem with it. I think a large camera feels better in the hands, but that's probably just me because I have big hands. But a large camera feels more steady and the buttons are nicely laid out for me. The screen on this camera is very small, as you can see here. It's barely even there. It has a very low resolution, very bad colors, but it's enough to check that you framed your image correctly, and you can zoom in on it to check focus, and you can also view the histograms. So it's not without its use, but you can't just blindly rely on this screen. The dials and buttons are very nicely laid out on this camera, and you can tell that this is kind of the same layout that they went for on a lot of their other cameras that came after this. It's pretty evident that Canon knew how to make cameras before they went digital, because all the wheels and dials are just, they're right where you expect them to be. If you're familiar with cameras like the Canon 10D and 30D, 40D, anything semi-professional, even the 1D cameras, this will feel familiar to you. So the buttons make working the camera really nice and intuitive, and I was actually a little bit surprised by how good this camera was to use. I was expecting something more, feeling more experimental and clunky. The viewfinder is decently nice and big, and it has all the 7 autofocus points with a cross type point in the middle, so it's nothing extremely fancy. Of course, you can't really expect an extremely good autofocus system on a camera like this, but in use, in practice, I find that the autofocus system is pretty nice. It's responsive, fast, and it's on the long list of things that pleasantly surprised me of using an old camera like this. And of course your autofocusing accuracy and speed is going to also depend on the autofocusing system in your lens. One of the downsides of this camera is that you can really tell it has a low computing power. It takes a few seconds to turn on, and often when shooting more than just a couple of images, you'll find that the screen just shows busy and that you have to wait for previewing images or going into the menu. This, of course, is because the camera is really old and it does put some limits on what you're doing. If you're dependent on having the ability to shoot lots of images quickly, this is not the camera for you. Choosing an autofocus point is also quite handy. You can also make it automatically choose the points. If not, you just hold one of the corner buttons here and you rotate your top dial to go sideways, and you can rotate your thumb dial to go up and down on the autofocus point. The menu system is also very simple. All you have to do is press the menu button and use the thumb wheel to scroll around, and it's just such a short menu and it's a breeze compared to my Sony a6400 that I'm filming on now, which has a super complicated menu that you can never find what you're actually looking for. I can still find everything that I need in this menu. Of course, this camera has fewer functions, but the menu is nice and intuitive and you can quickly find everything that you need. Of course, this camera has no video function and no live view, but what do you expect from a camera from 2003? But overall, on the physical side of things, I'm very impressed. The camera feels so nice and it feels kind of ahead of its time compared to what technology was like in 2003. Over to the side of image quality. Obviously, this is an old camera and the image quality is going to be a bit different, but it's still a very, very capable camera in the right conditions and in the right hands. The dynamic quality, even though I haven't done any real scientific tests, it feels worse than on the newer cameras. Feels like the sky is getting more blown out outside, and it just feels a little bit worse. You just have to keep that in mind when shooting, and it's its own look. Dynamic range as we know it today was completely unrealistic back in 2003, and you just have to take it into consideration when shooting. The resolution is low. 6.3 megapixels is not even 4K resolution, which is around 8 megapixels if I'm not wrong. And one image just barely fills my ultra-wide 1440p computer monitor, which felt kind of weird. Basically, when going 1:1 in Lightroom, there's barely any zooming in at all. Feels kind of strange, but obviously the pros of that is that you get much smaller image sizes, and if you nail the focus and you're not going to print everything out really big or cropping in anything at all, I would argue that you often don't really need more than 6 megapixels anyways. So yeah, very often when I'm shooting with other higher res cameras, the huge resolution just creates unnecessarily big image files and doesn't really do you any favors. Still, even though the resolution is worse and the dynamic range is lower, this camera takes some really, really nice photos when using good optics and of course using good lighting and photographing techniques and all that. There's nothing in the way of you taking super nice pictures with this, and if you feel that the technology is holding you back, it's probably because you're doing it wrong. That being said, lenses are still the most important thing here. Strap a horrible lens on this camera and you will still get horrible photos. If you strap a super high-end L lens on this camera, you can do some amazing things. And the last thing about image quality, of course, the ISO performance is going to be bad. I haven't done any super scientific testing on that either, but I can tell that using 1600 ISO or boosting it to 3200 is not a good idea if you want to have nice photos. But again, if you're using these kind of ISOs, then you're probably using this camera for something that you shouldn't using it for. This is not a sports camera or a wildlife photography camera. This is kind of a controlled environment or be happy with what you get when it comes to conditions camera. Some extra notes before we dive into the images. I could not get this camera to connect with my Windows 10 PC, even though I plugged it in with the USB cable there was just nothing happening. There was a connection sound, but no folder popping up. So I had to use a CF card reader to get the images onto my PC. And the other CF card that I had turned out to be a CF to SD adapter, which I'm using on my Canon 400D. And that did not work either in this camera. With that installed, the camera would not boot up properly. It would just be stuck in booting. So there are some considerations when using other memory cards on this camera. I got it with a 128 megabyte compact flash card, which kind of really brings in the nostalgia because it fits like 20 or 30 photos in RAW max. And that again takes you back to almost like shooting on film, because you can't just spray and pray. You have to actually think about what shots you want to keep, and you just have to make every shot count in another way. And that just kind of adds to the whole analog-ish retro old gear experience, in my opinion. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think, if I'm not wrong, that this camera can support up to 4 or 8 gigabytes memory cards, which would fit more photos than you would take before killing the battery on this thing. Some other good things about this camera is that it's obviously very inexpensive. If you find the right persons online selling them, they're often trying to sell them for maybe $50, but no one's buying them. So if you get lucky like me, you can get one that, yeah, this is in pristine condition. It almost looks brand new, which is kind of cool. And I got it for $10. You can also get these very cheap. Same goes for EF lenses. I got one, this is actually not a very old lens. It's a young new old 35mm f2.0 lens, which has some rattling inside. And for that reason, I got it for $20. So this is a very cheap combo, a combo of $30. But you can also, of course, put a nifty 50 Canon 50mm 1.8 or some other good bang for the buck lens on this one. And you can get a really cheap package to do some interesting stuff with. The fact that you cannot use EFS lenses on this thing, I don't really view that as a bad thing, because EFS lenses are usually not very impressive, and they are expensive for what they can do, and there's not a lot of them. So that's not a loss, in my opinion. Overall, I would absolutely recommend this camera. It seems like it might be turning into a collectible at this point, so I'm definitely keeping this one for the future. And just the fact that it has no BS functions, it's just a digital SLR camera that takes photos and nothing else. It's again, it's a nice contrast to today's world of perfection and AI, where you can just grab this camera and go out and take some photos and live with the technological limitations that it has. So yeah, this camera, I would recommend it. 10 out of 10. Just know what you're going to use it for and if it suits your needs. Now I think it's time to jump into Lightroom and just have a look at some photos.